lot of people talk about this camera as the sort of black sheep in the Fuji X-T line because of this flip out screen. It's the only X-T camera that has had a flip out screen. They all do the tilty. I've only ever used the X-T4, so I'm not going to compare it to any of those other ones. Personally, it hasn't really bothered me that much. I like closing it up so that the screen is facing the inside when I put it into a bag. But for this very same screen reason, this camera or the X-S20 often get recommended as the sort of best Fuji camera to get for video, since you can look at yourself while recording. Along with it having the 26 megapixel sensor instead of the newer 40 megapixel one. I've been using it for about 2 years now, and I feel like I have some pretty strong opinions on it. When it comes to image quality, there isn't really anything to complain about. Video and image quality is just pretty good to pretty great. I'm no savant at it. It also has 10-bit and F-Log, so you've got a lot of flexibility with color and editing choice as well. 4K 30 looks pretty great, which is what I mainly shoot in. You can shoot in 4K 60 with a pretty modest 1.18 times crop. Factors in together, so if you want to shoot 4K 60 with the active stabilization, you're sitting at 1.29 times. That's pretty modest compared to a lot of other cameras in this price range, or even higher, honestly, that sit at a 1.5 times crop at recording 60p. Fuji provides a nice couple of LUTs if you do record in F-Log and don't want to manually hand grade everything yourself, and they work pretty nicely based on a Turner, fairly flat, lower contrast looking profiles, so you can get to that 709 look pretty quickly and then make it look exactly how you want to after that. You can also record in any of the film simulations or any of the recipes you've created and saved to your camera. Oftentimes you might find that these are a little bit too contrasty for video specifically, so they might not always apply, but they can be a bit of fun and handy in a pinch. This being the 26 megapixel sensor instead of the newer 40 megapixels that's used in a lot of Fuji cameras, it has a lot less rolling shutter for video, hence why it's also recommended for video quite a lot. That doesn't mean there's no rolling shutter, but it is pretty subdued. The camera also does pretty unimpressive but still handy 240 frames per second video at 1080p. I didn't really use that much. When it comes to the recording options, there are so many options, and you've got basically everything under the sun except for like 4K 120 or OpenGate. I've never found myself wishing for a different recording setting, and you definitely have the newer H.265 video encoding for those slightly more efficient files to be compressed by. And also amazingly, there are 2 card slots. So I often like using one of the card slots for photo and the other for video. Makes things a little bit easier to organize later. You can use them both for video. That's entirely up to you, but it's very handy. As a talking head recorder, this camera is pretty awesome. You can probably just turn the face eye detect on and trust the continuous autofocus in that sort of situation, because it's just probably one person on camera at any given time. And then you can also just use the flip screen to frame yourself up. It's not the biggest screen in the world, but it still gives you a nice sort of indication for where you are in the frame. In terms of using it to film yourself to show off objects, it doesn't have any sort of product showcase feature, so you really have to obscure your face and get the object pretty close up to the camera if you want to show something a bit like this. A lot of people will purchase this camera for the top dials. They are pretty handy and awesome. A little bit frustrating for a hybrid camera if you're using the shutter speed dial for photos and ISO for video specifically, instead of using the the T or the auto, because when you switch from photo to video and you're maybe at 400 ISO and 500 shutter speed and then you change to video, you're going to have to change both of those knobs. These 2 knobs specifically here at least have a locking mechanism. The locking mechanism is pretty good because these can get knocked pretty easily, especially while taking them in and out of a bag, which is the issue with the drive mode selector that I've had. I have pulled my camera out of my bag so many times, and the drive mode has gone from single shot to HDR or continuous low so many different times, and it's very frustrating to deal with. Since the autofocus can be a bit on the dicier side, you have this toggle to go from single, continuous or manual. I really quite like this. You don't have to go digging through any menus. You can just turn it and know exactly where it's going to be. So if you're in a situation where you know the autofocus is going to struggle, where there might be a bunch of people in the frame, you can maybe set it to 5.6 or f8 and go manual focus and just set it to 3 or 5 meters and you're off to the races. The amount of times I've been recording with this, and I've been using the specific small focus box to choose my focus, and then for whatever reason, maybe my box is down here in the frame, and then whatever reason it's decided to pick up someone in the left. I would have thought that it would only look for a face or eye within the boundaries or the focus box that I have set, because I'm not in the wide mode. But that's not how it works with this camera. It's very frustrating. And then you're trying to focus down here, something's happening over here, and it's now picked up someone over there shooting shallow depth of field. The whole shot is off. It wouldn't be too bad if I could turn the face eye auto detect off while recording, but I can't. I've even got a button that I specifically dedicate on this camera to turning on and off the face eye auto detect, because it has been such a problem like this. But I have no way of changing it while recording. I have to stop my recording, press the button, resume my recording. This camera has epic battery life. In photos, it's unbeatable, it's incredible. In video, it's always going to be very difficult on a camera. But even on this, it's still so good. I have been recording for 20 to 30 minutes in outdoor sunlight in 30+ degree Australian summer, and sometimes barely put a dent of 50% in the camera. And let alone with the direct sunlight on it that whole time, there's been no overheating warnings. Camera got a little warm, yeah, but anything would. Found the auto levels on the internal and external mics to be a little bit inconsistent, so I've personally found that I'm better off just setting them to a manual setting. I really wanted to use this as a webcam because I do get pretty sick of the, up the nose view from laptops. I don't have mine propped up, so I was pretty excited. Unfortunately, this doesn't have the newer USB protocol that a lot of cameras are coming out these days that just sort of natively allow you to register your camera as a webcam for Zoom or Teams or something like that. So you have to download this software from Fuji X Webcam 2. I was lucky to get it to work even half the time. It's very finicky. You have to set up some specific settings on your camera. You have to make sure that everything's installed properly. Oftentimes I've found that you can't have the camera already on before you try to plug it in and get it to work. If you do try to get it to work in general, everybody in your Zoom, Teams, Google Meets meeting will know that you're trying to use a different fancy camera, because it will blast Fuji X webcam banner all across instead of what would ideally be your face, because it takes so long to load up, if it does load up. And then once you've actually got it maybe working, none of the top dials or focus controls or whatever will do anything. You're completely locked out of changing any sort of exposure settings in that regard. So if you have it set to specific shutter speed and ISO before you plug it in, and you find that you're overly exposed or underexposed, can't change it, you're gonna have to unplug it, turn the camera off, change those settings and try to guess basically. It's very unintuitive, poor design. And again, that's even if you can get it to work in the first place. Just using this as a video cam really isn't easy a lot of the time. Really micromanage the exposure and white balance settings. A lot of these things I'm going to bring up to someone who shoots, I have to lock in my ISO, my aperture, completely lock in the shutter speed while videoing. Otherwise, the exposure just loves to rampantly change while recording as the scene changes, which it's not an unexpected thing, it's just more how it does it. It does it very quickly. It's not a nice smooth process over a second or so. It just likes to do it as quickly as possible, so it's very noticeable exactly when it happens. I have set my exposure wrong before and locked it in. If I try to change it while recording, it doesn't do it in a smooth step, in a smooth motion. It does it in a linear step. So if I find myself needing to drop the exposure, I can stop down a little bit on my lens, or I can adjust the ISO. But if I do that, it's going to do it very drastically. It's going to go from being this bright down to this bright very quickly instead of just smoothly changing. Similarly with the white balance, it does very similar things. It loves to change and drift as you point the camera at different objects. A lot of people lock in their white balance in video, which is good. I have found myself needing to dedicate a button to doing that, because I'm not always going to be shooting in log, so I'm not always going to just lock it to 5500 Kelvin. Also, if you factor in any time you do any sort of zooming while recording, there's a very good chance that the exposure is going to shift there for whatever reason, even though you're not necessarily changing any settings. It can happen. It happens sometimes, or maybe not as bad when you've got everything locked off. But if you're in anything auto, then it's going to think that some crazy stuff is happening. and it's going to drastically change and be very distracting anytime you zoom. So if you combine zooming in, causing a loss of focus because it's not parfocal and it's not always that quick to change, with the fact that the exposure might drastically shift, then it's going to be a very noticeable thing that happens. So I often have to lock off all of these settings, choose not to zoom in or zoom out of any sort of actions while recording, and it just becomes really limiting at that point. I can't put anything of this in auto and trust that it's going to do exactly what I want. Okay, the autofocus. It stinks. Okay, well, I'm being a little bit over dramatic right now. It is good enough for the most part and pretty solid until it really isn't. And it drives me up the wall so far that it makes me want to get a different camera. And before dumping all over it, it's still usable in a variety of situations. As I talked about before, using it as a talking head camera. If it's a nice sunny day out, you can set it to an f8, get a really wide depth of field so that if the autofocus does any sort of unusual shifting or can't decide what to lock onto, that large depth of field is going to sort of counteract that as long as it's not going from minimum to infinity. Or if you only have maybe one subject in your scene, you're probably not going to have too many issues. But as soon as things become a little bit more complex and there's some movement, all hell can break loose at any given time. And you just never really know exactly what to expect. And the inconsistency is the real killer, because being able to predict poor autofocus is fine, but if it's solid autofocus that is completely unpredictable, it makes it so much worse. It can pick up eyes pretty well at a closer, maybe 2 to 3 sort of meter distance range, but anything beyond that, good luck, it's probably not going to pick them up. And then sometimes it's going to randomly pick up a chair in the corner or a door handle or something like that, thinking it's an eye, and then you're just left wondering what the heck is going on. If you want to just try to circumvent the autofocus altogether and use manual focus on Fuji lenses kind of sucks. It's not a linear response, and while you're recording, you can't punch in to get critical focus, so it can be really hard to tell if you're actually in focus or not. And then if you add in the fact that there's no tracking autofocus option, so if you wanted to circumvent needing to use the face eye detect altogether and wanted to just put a box on someone's head or chest, there's no option to do that in video. It's just not in there for whatever reason. You can do it in photo, but not video. And sometimes if you even just want to use it as a single point of autofocus, AF single, maybe I'm recording something, I'm going to focus on the chair that I'm going to sit on. So I've had experiences where sometimes even that wouldn't work. I would just get a red box or red indicator telling me that it can't acquire focus, even though it's something that's 3 meters away. It's just a woven chair in front of a white wall. Makes absolutely no sense why it can't get focus there. And then possibly the most annoying part is just the tragic lack of autofocus options. I said before, there's no continuous tracking mode for you to use. There's a wide mode, which could end up focusing on anything. And then the other option is just a small box that you have to micromanage yourself and point it over wherever the person you're looking at is walking at. So if maybe you wanted to track someone from behind, you have to manually move this box and make sure it stays on them at any given moment, and hoping that the autofocus doesn't just lose its chops and just focus on something outside of the box anyway. And there's so much variation between the autofocusing capabilities of the different lenses you might put on this. Third party, it's typically I've found that it's a little bit slower than the new first party specifically. The X mount is pretty old, so if you're using any of the older lenses, then those older lenses kind of have just generally crappier focus motors and just don't behave as well, which is that's fair enough. But I would have thought, just a fairly modern Sigma 18 to 50, it performs noticeably worse than a newer Fuji first party lens, not even a specifically special one like a 23mm f2, something like that. Regarding IBIS, quite a big problem I've encountered while using this camera is when using wider lenses, 24mm full frame equivalent and wider, there's something that I call the wide angle wobble. It's not exclusive to Fuji cameras. I've seen it on Canons and other systems, but I knew about it before I got the camera, and I thought it wouldn't be a problem until those more ultra wide levels of, sort of 16mm. But I found that even using a Sigma 16mm on this camera, you could get weird warbly jello sort of effect in the corners. It's very difficult to see it happening in camera as well. You really only notice it after. The only way to get it out of your footage is to crop in probably, I don't know, 10 or 20%, and then it's very difficult to work with that because you're framing it as if you're going to have the whole frame. The other way is to just turn IBIS off and to get maybe shaky footage and stabilize it in post. It's just a little bit frustrating that you have to work around these issues, considering 24mm isn't even that wide. If you're shooting around 28 to 40mm, the IBIS system in this is great. It stabilizes things very well, almost no shakes really. It'll do a smidge of locking on like it does in the more shorter telephoto sort of range. Another problem re-emerges the further you get into the telephoto range. The IBIS system on this camera really likes to lock on to something. When you're at 35mm full frame equivalent, it's not as big of an issue, but when it's something as far away as 75+mm, it really locks on, and any sort of movements by the camera are largely cancelled out until you move the camera so far that the IBIS physically cannot move the sensor far enough to keep whatever it was locked on in frame. So you end up getting this stable footage until, boom, it's down here very drastically and suddenly, and it's quite unpleasant to look at. Again, like it kept the footage very stable throughout, but in this sort of situation, I would have preferred it to just take out the wobbles and everything as opposed to trying to really lock onto something. Just generally speaking, I have been this hard on this camera because I loved using it, and I've just really wished it was better in some situations. If I was just using it for only photo, I probably wouldn't have as many complaints, but I've been trying to use it a lot more for maybe more so video than photo, and that's when it really just starts to rear some problems. So if you're looking to get this camera, you're gonna have a great time using it for photo and video, but if you're using it for any less than 70% photo, I would maybe recommend looking into something a little bit more video centric.